Hello, everyone, and welcome to another long awaited, more longly awaited episode of Relating to DevSecOps, where we explore the development, security, and operational issues of today so we can solve real world problems with people that face them. And even against the security criticism that DevSecOps is dead, we believe that it is just getting started. I'm your host, Ken Toller, and I'm joined again by Mike McCabe, my wonderful co host, as we embark on this rainy day in August. It's been almost, I guess, over a month since we last recorded. Mike, what's up? I'm in this blameless culture. I blame no one, but
The retro says we've both been traveling and busy, and we both got crowd struck. So
yes,
that's what happened.
CrowdStrike has definitely thrown a wrench into things, but I think we're saving that for another episode. We have many, many thoughts about it,
And
but I
many
probably
emotions too.
yeah, emotions. Um, yeah, I was attacked on my view, but we'll save it for another day. But all good. No, not today's episode. Today's episode is all around the power and necessity of metrics and measurement and security, and how that relates to DevSecOps, especially our definition of DevSecOps around collaboration with other groups and teams and departments, and why it's important to automate and ensure that you have a good way to measure things. So we'll start it off with just making sure that we're all on the same page, and let's talk a bit about what metrics are. So, Mike, what is your view on metrics, measurement in security? And I mean, pick a discipline: cloud security, network security, whatever, or general. What do you think about metrics? What are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically some unit of measure, could be volume of something over time, could be something more squishy than that. It's the vibe someone has or the vibe a group has about something. So metrics can be a lot of different things. I always think about the security focus on. We've always been so focused on like bugs, finding CVEs, vulnerabilities, bugs. That's like been the big metric that I think security is focused on. But we can go into why I don't think that's always the best metric. But just to start, I mean, what is your take on metrics? What's the? You probably have some fancy schmancy definition of it. So
I don't think it's fancy. I think we can talk a little bit about like what makes a good metric. Um, but fundamentally, it's anything you can measure, right? I think that's the fundamentals. But I don't think that we do a lot of it. I think we talk about one of the things that I was going to talk about today is that you know we focus a lot on completion, like task completion for security. Like I implemented the IR program or something along those lines. But I think a metric is anything you can measure over time, and and I think that's a good spin off of really what makes a good metric. And I was recently working with a client that really challenges groups to make sure that their metrics follow the SMART framework. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And I think if you take all of your metrics through that, it's pretty it's pretty interesting. I can't say that that I follow that all the time, but I do think that it should be measurable and time bound. I find that the best metrics that I have been able to generate for showcasing anything are over time. So like, you mentioned number of vulnerabilities. Well, a number of vulnerabilities is one thing, but number of vulnerabilities within a specific time period or something along those lines is like a much more valuable thing. So let's talk about what you think a good metric is and some ways or examples of good metrics versus just things that you can measure.
Yeah, I mean, I think my philosophy when I was a young buck coming up through security, it was always,
Still a
focused
young
on.
buck, Mike. Come on
I
now.
don't think so. The
I don't
back
see any
pain,
gray
the
beard
back pain and the
happening.
lack of hair tell a different story. But yeah, we were very focused on finding issues. The value security proved was finding issues. Um, more vulnerabilities in the source code, more vulnerabilities in the pen test, things like that. Like how many things are we finding? Because that's the value. We're finding risks and presenting it to the business. I think a more interesting metric these days to me is moving to prevention. I feel like we've talked about this at least a little bit in the podcast, but how, and this is a hard thing to prevent because hard thing to measure, because how do you measure something that doesn't exist? But I do think it's an interesting thing to think about, is instead of saying, all right, we found 15 production bugs, we fixed those 15 production bugs, what is the way of measuring to basically say, like, nothing, no new vulnerabilities get created? I think it'd be interesting to measure how either you prevent those earlier in the life cycle, you prevent developers from making these mistakes. Something like that is more interesting to me. I also have always thought like mean time to fix issues is a good metric to think about, because again, if you find something but it sits there in a Jira ticket for 6 months, you haven't really resolved any risk. You found the risk, people might be aware of it. Jira is very well aware of the risk because it's sitting there, but it's not making any progress. And so, if you can really tighten that loop of both preventing bugs from happening, and then when they do happen, really quickly remediating them, because they're always going to happen, I feel like those are interesting metrics to have from a very tactical perspective. But what about you? What's your favorite metric?
My favorite metric is actually I'm gonna try to find this while you're talking, maybe. But there was an AWS talk a while ago where God, I can't remember what it was called, but I love the talk, and it talks about how like when you are looking at metrics, especially an incident response, that there needs to be a significant enough baseline, and that really what you're looking for is the anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that idea because we always talk about, oh, we need all this telemetry and data, and we're running these logs, and we have all these things and all these graphs. And it's like, okay, well, what are we trying to get out of it? And this idea that it should be a flat line until it's not is really interesting, because it's like you need to make sure that you have a baseline. Everyone's baseline is different. And then any major deviation from that baseline through a threshold is a significant event. And that's what you need to trigger on, like on the incident response side. So I've always taken that to heart because it really makes me think about like what is our baseline, and then where can we measure significant change. And so I've not, maybe I can't apply that particular baseline to everything, but I can sort of think about all of the other metrics that we have. And what that makes me think about is like, what are we trying to achieve with the metrics that we are putting together? So even if we say like mean time to respond, like my question there is, what are you trying to showcase in that metric? So I think you're trying to showcase the attentiveness and speed of fixes that your developers are doing, right? So then you start to ask yourself other questions like, what are the other ways that we can showcase how fast developers are fixing issues, or how they are addressing issues, or what the issues are. So then you start to think of how many of those are critical, how often are they introducing those issues, how often is the developer that introduced the issue remediating the issue. So it lets you think more about what you're trying to achieve rather than trying to come up with this arbitrary metric, which I think is our big failure in security, is that we're just looking to measure stuff. We don't really have an idea of what we're trying to do, which is why if you look at, one vulnerability management system, they will say you have 30,000 vulnerabilities, and they will, classify them by host and everything, and they have their different ways of adjusting severity and cutting these metrics up because we're just sort of shooting in the dark between these different attributes like severity and categorization and all that, but we're not really asking the businesses, what do you want to do with this metric? Like, are you trying to drive down the vulnerabilities? Why are you focusing on critical? What is it that you measure as critical? You really need to get into the business mindset of generating those metrics in order to make a move. Because if you go to a CEO and say, we remediated 10,000 vulns, they're like, that's a big number, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But is it just as important or less important as someone that brought 1,000 vulns to their CEO? There's no context.
Yeah. Yeah. You could fix one Docker image and remediate 10,000 vulnerabilities that weren't exploitable, and you still have that, RCE sitting in one image out there that's just your single critical that is actually going to get popped. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. Like another thing is, effort of remediation, right? If you can quantify that against your metrics, like that'd be great. Like, how many critical issues do we have with low remediation effort?
hmm
Like that's actually a good. I mean, I love that because it means like this is the bucket of issues. If that is very high and the high complexity ones are low, that's an interesting indicator. And then the inverse of that, if we have a bunch of complex vulnerabilities and a low amount of whatever easy remediation vulnerabilities, what does that say? So those are interesting metrics to me, right? That's interesting data.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so going back to mean time to remediate, I think it's interesting because it shows a process, but it also shows there's communication and kind of open lines of communication from what the security team is doing to like technical teams, which I think is less of a pure like metric. That means there's a lot of work going on the behind the scenes with the security team to be like, hey, we have these things detecting vulnerabilities. These are what they mean. This is how you consume them. And this is, you've driven home the importance of remediating these either through, hey, security is everyone's job, or through you have an SLA of 3 hours on a critical vulnerability, something like that. But I think that's an interesting metric because it shows there's been cultural change in an organization versus like, hey, we found 10,000 new vulnerabilities. Okay, you just implemented a new SaaS tool. Congratulations. You haven't changed the security or the culture of the organization at all. And I was just joking before we recorded, but like you always say about DevSecOps, it's not about throwing security tools into a pipeline. It's about organizational and cultural change and a philosophy and mental shift. So I think those kind of metrics are interesting. Something that I also find interesting that from a consulting perspective, a lot of times you talk to clients and you like say you do an app test or something like that. They're like, all right, we're going to fix the highs. We want you to retest those. Then we're going to, close out the engagement and we'll probably leave the mediums and lows. I think it'd be really interesting to see because in security, there's a lot of talk about defense in depth, but I don't always feel like that's not how a lot of people adopt security. Like they're like, I'm doing a pen test because my SOC 2 requires me to do it, and I'm going to fix the highs so my pen test report doesn't look like a mess when I give it to a customer. But that leaves out all the lows and mediums that mean your environment is, a little weaker. And when you see real world attacks, like they're often chaining issues together. So it's not like they're only taking the one SQL injection. They're taking, multiple failures together to try to get access to things. So I think that'd be an interesting metric of saying like, okay, you do a great job of fixing the highs, but how well are you sticking to fixing the mediums and the lows? And I think the other piece to what you're saying about the complexity, I'm a big fan of if there's really easy, low risk things to fix, like encrypting something can be a single checkbox. Just do it. It's a low risk. Yeah, it's not going to save you from, it's not going to save you from the SQL injection, but like just fix the low risk, low complexity things as well as the higher risk issues that may or may not take time to fix. That's something that I think about a lot. Is just trying to build more hardened environments that are just harder to hack. And I feel like people always think about just high risk.
Yeah, you you mentioned something that uh, I'm, I mean, certainly guilty of is like when you have an opportunity where a business finds this is something everybody faces, right? Finds reaching compliance valuable. That if you find something to measure that you can move the needle, even if it's the wrong needle on a security metric, you are more likely to do it because you're really being incentivized to do it. I think the hard path and but ultimately if you push forward with it will result in like a more secure environment like you're talking about where you're not focusing on these folks people do not focus on the lows and mediums because they don't have the impact on their compliance report or they're not being pushed down from the top is the challenge is making your security case meet the business case. So if you're saying, hey, like we only are going to solve all the highs and the criticals, it's sort of up to the security engineers to create the more accurate picture to showcase that the full attack chain is more critical than a single critical vulnerability. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like now you have to start looking at how you can chain the mediums and highs together or pushing on those to demonstrate the criticality of the medium and then raising the criticality of the medium issue and then
Yeah.
getting that into the list of highs and criticals, even though it's not a standalone higher critical issue. And there's been some push to do that, especially like on the CrowdStrike side for like they have their like XPNT or PRT or whatever score for, this issue has been used or this issue has been exploited or I don't know if it's still relevant. I haven't used Rapid7 in a while, but they used to have like an application security rating where it was like, the exploitability score or something along those lines. If you want to raise an issue like that where it's like this is a real security threat, that's your charge, right? Is to tie this to the business need or to tie it to the motivation of the business because I've found that the losing battle is unfortunately trying to say I know that you want like everybody wants a more secure product. And so trying to say this thing where you go this is the more secure path, we should do that is not a winning business argument. You know,
Yeah.
all the time. I think that when companies are in feast mode, they're going to be like, "Yes, let's do it." But if a company starts to face any financial hardship or they're adjusting for revenue or whatever, they're going to do the thing that like meets the bottom line. And so you need to make sure that your business cases, your metrics, your quantifiable data also has the bottom line in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely true. Definitely makes it a lot harder when you're not in those feast modes and it's like, yeah, we're knocking out the criticals, we're knocking out the highs, we're passing SOC 2 and we're moving on.
Yeah,
But
and I
yeah,
think a
for
lot of
sure.
folks get really frustrated with that. Like as security professionals, they're like, "Yeah, this company doesn't take security seriously," and they probably don't. But it's like we either, they're making a prioritization decision, and what's the easiest thing to prioritize is like revenue.
Yeah.
So, so it's tough, and I mean it's something that is like a battle that you're like really judgy about when you're young, and then it's like over time you just it's like if you want to do the good work, you have to speak the same language.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I do think there's the philosophical change you go through, I think, in your security career of like you're never going to beat people in a submission with these things. So you have to make the business argument, or you have to basically find it where you can to get these things done. Because yeah, it's easy to say, oh, these are high risk, these are criticals, and those get done. But it's much harder when it's a medium and a low to kind of use the risk angles. Then you have to find ways to resolve the mediums and lows by being a little more creative. But
Yeah. Just a quick aside there, like to drive that point home, even though it's not metrics related, I have a really good story about this where I found some old documentation from another consultant that was at a company like 3 or 4 years prior to me engaging with this client, and they had like 4 out of 5 of their like main priorities were the same priorities, right? It was like there needs to be an incident response program. There's like a lack of vulnerability like all these things. And I found it. I was like, oh, well, like we did these things. Like we did the incident response program. We had all this stuff. But I found the old presentation. It was just like, are your typical, we need this, we need this, we need this. These are the gaps. And it aligned with, this framework. But the thing that was the thing that needed to be said on the organization was like, these things are going to help us engage with the community because the ecosystem and the community cares about this. And that mental shift is what allowed us to push those priorities rather than being like, this is a security ask. It's like we're connecting with the people that use the product. So if you make that mental shift, like you have to sell it. And I
Yeah.
think that the metrics will help with that. So then all of your metrics have to align with that mentality. So you might, in incident response capability, you might be like, how effective were we at engaging with the community during this incident response? How effective are we with getting our updates on the status page? What were the Twitter responses, or what was the backlash in the news from us being able to be on top of this thing? CrowdStrike is a great example of this, right? Like if we are, what does our brand look like when we fail to do this stuff? Like that's a great argument for incident response metrics. If you can tie into that, I think it's really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. For interesting. For sure. I think it's interesting, kind of going back to incident response, and I think you have some experience here that I'd like to kind of hear, which is the downside of metrics, which there's, I think of security as like there's a technical problem, then there's the squishy culture awareness side to it, which is like, you know, yeah, you can have all the best tooling, you can have the best process, but like you have to have people thinking about how things can go wrong as well. Sometimes the tooling can help influence that, and that's where metrics can help. But then, like, where do metrics go wrong? When can you have too many metrics, or when can going from being very metrics focused kind of becomes its own thing compared to actually trying to influence the organization and get stuff done? You know, is that relevant at all to you?
Yeah. I think I don't think that you can have I don't think that you can have too much data or too many metrics. But I think that when those metrics become the work, that's when you might have an issue. So I think that it's always healthy to have more data. Like ignoring like data confidentiality and all that. Like when it comes to being able to look at things effectively, the more data you have, as long as it's accurate, I think the better you can be at determining like where you can go. But I think that there are some cases I've seen where the focus is so much on visibility that it becomes like 3 or 4 hours out of a particular day for you to be able to, like, you have to put this label in, or you have to categorize this issue. And so you've added workload to the function. And that's where I think the automation it comes in, right? It generating that data is a tough job too. So if your balance is off, then it's not going to work because now you're affecting the function and the capability. Does that make sense? Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, I think the only thing that I think you didn't cover is I do think not everything in security you can quantify. You know, like say you do a developer training and you just like influence the crap out of people, and these people stop introducing so many bugs. I guess you could say like, okay, pre the date of the training, post the date of the training, there's less bugs. But I think these things are very like squishy, and I think to your point, if you're spending if there's 8 hours a day, 7 hours if you include lunch and all the other, stuff that happens during a day, and you're spending half of that time measuring the work you're doing versus doing the work for visibility reasons, or because to make sure as an organization you're tracking the right direction, like, and this is true not just in security, this is true anywhere. But yeah, you're kind of losing the plot there of the point of having a security team. The point is not for them to create better metrics about what they're doing, but the point is to secure an organization through, technology, process, influence, culture, awareness, all those things. So I agree with you. I think it gets, and this, it reminds me of this interview I saw with Jeff Bezos. You may have heard of him, but I'm not like a huge Bezos nerd, but he did say something interesting, which is like Amazon's famously focused on metrics, and like you have to be able to, if you want to do anything, you have to be able to say before and after what the metrics are going to be. And he was saying that, trust the metrics, but also trust your gut. And he gave the example of the person who led customer service was like, yes, our reviews are stellar, our wait times are super low. And he was like, all right, let's just call the customer support number and let's see. And they called, and then he sat on wait for 10 minutes. So it's like, yeah, the metrics are all telling you like, yeah, everything is perfect, but customer complaints are still up. And so you just go and you kind of put your money where your mouth is, test how things actually work. You trust your gut on how things work and see the reality for it. Because yeah, metrics are one aspect of the overall environment. People with zero vulnerabilities in production will still get hacked. That's just because their metrics are imperfect, and nothing is perfect. And you have to trust your gut, to be well informed from multiple sources, not just what the dashboard's saying. That's a rambling way of getting to my point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I kind of agree. I do agree that there are some things that are squishy. Like you mentioned, was this training effective or not? But I think that is also it's a measurement that you don't have enough time embedded with. So if you delivered the training, 10 times, and you notice that 80% of the organizations improved after the training, that's a significant metric, again, over time. But if it's like I did the training and I wanted to see if like one time I asked the company, and then the next 3 times I didn't do a survey, and then the fifth time I changed the training content, and the 6th time I changed the training like, then you don't have any consistency in the data. So yeah, it is kind of squishy and hard to measure. So the more frequent you can, the frequency of the data also matters there. So if you cannot get that frequency of data, then it's not going to be a good data set to conduct a measurement on. And then you do sort of have to go with your gut of like, am I getting there? But even if you are like, you're still reaching out to people. Like when we first started this podcast, and not to say that we're super popular right now, but the user base is going up. So like some people are finding this valuable, right? And like people listen for longer. But it's like, I think at some point you're like we're doing it just because we like talking to each other about stupid things like this, and some people find it valuable, right? But if we were really going for it, we might pivot and say, we did the last 10 episodes and we covered these subjects, and we sort of do a little bit of that analysis on the back end, and we gather feedback, but it's kind of opportunistic. And if we were doing this for money, we might be like really aggressive with that, and really like much more on the ball with getting that data from users and reaching out proactively and having these user group and all that kind of thing. So that's for you to do. And
more AI. That's what we'll do.
Yeah.
All AI, all the time.
I did find this link. It's called OX32 Shades of 7F, 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 the hex code for gray. Attention between absolutes and ambiguity and security. I'll link it in the chat. Well, not the chat, but the show notes. But it talks about, providing maximum business value at minimum risk and minimum cost. It's like perfect. So definitely recommend that as a watch.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think it's interesting, and it's like, every tool is good and bad. You know, like a hammer's a perfect thing for a nail, but it's not great for a screw. If my analogy is working for you there.
Yeah, I mean,
But
you can drive it though.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But then you kind of lose the point of the screw. But anyway,
I don't know, man. If we expand this thing, it's like enough pressure, you can make it happen.
yeah. But
Yeah.
the point
I don't
of
know
it
if
is
this.
not
I don't know if this is more.
to
If you
blow
put people
up the
under
thing you're
enough
doing.
pressure, Mike, they will eventually yield.
That's true. Yes. If you shut down all the computers at the company, you are more secure.
Yeah. I do love quantifying things that seem like in quantifiable, I guess. I like this idea of trying to find the squishy things you're talking about and seeing how we can measure them, because I think that if we can figure it out, like that's a game changer, right? And being able to quantify some of this stuff is really kind of a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It is interesting, and it's a math thing, but really it's also an organizational thing of figuring out what metrics are representative of change in an organization, which is it's a fun, different world to think about besides just thinking about vulnerabilities and code in the cloud.
Yeah. Well, we're at 30 minutes, but one thing that I wanted to end with is if you had to tell folks or leave folks with something to avoid, what is the biggest pitfall in metrics generation that you think that there is, or that people make mistakes with?
I think we've sort of covered it, but I guess it would be three things of don't trust all the metrics over what your gut is telling you about what's going on in your environment. Don't try to overmeasure things because you feel like that's how you're going to prove the value of what you're doing. And definitely, to your point, align the metrics with what the business is doing. Don't make them completely tangential to what's going on. What
Yeah.
about you?
I've only got one. Biggest pitfall for me is just avoid count metrics, which is just like how many, you know,
Hmm.
how many X. If there's no Y, if there's no time, if there's no by person, by category, by severity, whatever, if it's just a count, I think that's the wrong metric.
Yep, makes
Yeah.
sense. I thought you were going to say avoid Jira, but
I mean, yeah, you could do that. I think but that, we've been saying that for years, and we're still not there.
yep.
It just keeps sucking us back in with new features and
It's
more
got
money.
AI.
Yeah. So
What are you going to do?
what are you gonna do? Well, I think that kind of wraps it up for us. If you have any questions, please reach out. And if you are interested in listening more, you can find us on www.r2dso.com or on R2DSO Twitter at R2DSO. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.